All right. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. I have to apologize to those who I saw last night for dinner and afterwards for discussions. I might have one or the other thing that you might have heard already, but repetition always helps to hammer home the message. So I hope I don't bore you too much. I've taken the theme that's been given, and I try to look at this. How can we best look at this particular thing from the perspective of the European Central Bank? And this is what I would like to run you through, a little bit the conceptual framework and how EMU has originally been set up, and then how the gaps have been revealed during the crisis and what we can do about this, how we from the ECB side would see it. And so you will see the analysis is very much something that comes out of someone who is on the monetary policy side and how I look at the at this. Now, central bankers tend to look at this setup as how do we design the institutions of economic and monetary union from the perspective of what's been set up in 81 by Sargent and Wallace about monetary dominance or fiscal dominance. And that is, do you create an institutional framework that has the risk that at the end of the day, fiscal policymakers, governments can force the hand of the central bank into doing something it wouldn't otherwise do, that might not be in line with its mandate to preserve price stability. Or vice versa, do you create a framework of what we call monetary dominance, meaning that you establish a framework that the central bank can truly focus on preserving price stability and do this in full independence without having its hand forced by governments that get themselves into trouble. And you see, Morgan Stanley just recently dug this up again. So the name of the game is fiscal dominance, the inability or unwillingness of governments to rein in debts and deficits, and it becomes a binding constraint on monetary policy and may well collide with the objective of price stability. Precisely, this is the kind of thing that Maastricht and the setup of the Maastricht Treaty was set out to prevent that we ever get in a situation like this. And in July, the bank will publish an article on this, also on the interaction between fiscal and monetary policy during the crisis, which will go very much into this, and so I give you a little bit of a preview, if you want, of this. Here, sure, no, I didn't know that. So this is a little bit a model that people have been writing about. Is that most recently, Jean, in a paper of 2012, the idea is basically if you have a severe financial crisis and a deterioration of the fiscal position, let's say the Irish situation, or you have irresponsible public spending, say in a kind of stylized form, that's the Greek situation, and you come to the moment where the government hits a fiscal limit, that it cannot extract more taxes to pay for this, then you say what's gonna happen, and also you have this exaggeration that suddenly the markets suddenly start to question the sustainability of the fiscal position. And then you can have two ways. You can have the debt monetization, meaning fiscal dominance. That means basically the government say, look, we can't pay anymore, the central bank must print more money. Pay up my government debt, and this way we keep afloat. Now, if you do this, the central bank loses, in a sense, its credibility, and of course has massive issues to maintain price stability. If you want, this is maybe a caricature, this is the route down of the Central Bank of Zimbabwe, all right? When Robert Mugabe comes and says, I need another 50 million, and the central bank prints it. And that is when you get 6-digit inflation rates, okay? Or you can, the hard dominance, where basically we say, well, we do not finance government, you must find a different way out, and then you come to, there's this one idea of the sovereign default, or you come to a situation, and this is what is here in this model described, where the banks get increasingly nervous, the financial markets get increasingly nervous, and there's this risk of a financial meltdown. Now, this is in a sense the setup at the fiscal limit. The question is there any way we can do to overcome this? What are the bits, if the central bank will stay hard, what are the things that we can do? Now, in designing EMU, I've started this, we have done a setup at Maastricht that was based on the sound money, sound finances consensus. And I've dug up a few quotes from the Delors report in 1989. Basically, they foresaw this whole thing already to a certain extent and precisely the dynamics behind it. It says, in particular, uncoordinated and divergent national budgetary policies would undermine monetary stability. So this precisely this idea that the fiscal authorities can get the monetary authority into trouble, and thereby stopping it from being able to pursue its primary objective. And precisely this recognition we've written into the Maastricht Treaty. You have here mainly the monetary financing provision. I have a nicer picture, and these are the four kind of constitutional pillars that from our perspective, so to speak, the institutional context of the central bank is. Yes, a clear orientation towards price stability. That is the job of the central bank. It is independent from the politicians. There is a monetary financing prohibition and what we call privileged access to credit. And there's the no bailout clause, which means no country should assume the liabilities of another country. I put this down here as pillars because these are not things that can be changed easily, especially if you speak to audiences elsewhere in the world. They think, why can't you just do this? Why can't you be like the Fed or something like this? And the point is, these are some of the things that, for example, the German Constitutional Court, back in 92 and 93, when there was a challenge against the Maastricht Treaty, the German Constitutional Court said, yes, the German mark could be brought into the euro, and Germany can be part of economic monetary union on condition that the new economic and monetary policy setup basically delivers an equivalent result in terms of preserving the stability of the currency. And I said, what are these things? And it's precisely those things that you see here. So if we now go after those, then you are putting the axe on one of the pillars of economic and monetary union. Now, ideally, this would have worked in this way, that you have fiscal rules. It is clear the central bank will not step in. It is clear the other member states will not step in and help you out. The markets show you very clearly that if you go out of line, your yields go up and the risk premia rise. And as a result of this kind of virtuous circle, member states would do the right kind of thing and keep their fiscal house in order. That was the underlying assumption, that this would work. I'll explain a bit more in a paper that is coming. Now, what went wrong? Well, I don't have now a chart on the fiscal rules, because it's been discussed at length, but it's very interesting, again, going back to the Delors report, is that already in 1989, so none of this is new under the sun, so to speak, Delors and the Delors committee said that access to a large capital market may for some time even facilitate the financing of economic imbalances. So this notion that, of course, the one-size-fits-all that has risks for the build-up of economic imbalances, and some of those you see on the right-hand side, which is unit labor cost compared to Germany, then you see that basically countries lost competitiveness, live beyond their means, precisely because they weren't watching those imbalances, because they felt in a low interest rate, low inflation environment, this is the kind of thing that is feasible. And you also, of course, had what went wrong was the low pricing of sovereign risk. In a sense, for years, to say it simply, Greek government debt was as good as German government debt. There was an implicit assumption that this is all the Eurozone, this is all kind of the same, with no differentiation whatsoever about the fiscal position that is behind those debt instruments, and any notion of what it would imply for the actual ability of those governments, the Greek government, the Italian government, the Spanish government, etc., to finance this. It was all looked at the same way, and this underpricing of risk probably has now given way to an overpricing of risk. Now, the other thing that went wrong is kind of the missing elements. And again, I go back to 1989. Delors, he also, in the committee, they also foresaw this idea that the market's disciplining mechanisms might not actually work the way you would like them to work. It might be too slow or too harsh or too abrupt. In a sense, he almost foresaw the idea of a sudden stop in financing of governments through the markets. That is something so far we've only seen in emerging markets. In the Asian crisis, when suddenly money turned away and said, look, we're out of here. We didn't expect that something like this could happen to, if you want, a club of well-governed advanced economies, which was the euro area. And suddenly we've seen it, that basically investors en masse turn away from Greek government debt. And so we're not buying anything anymore. And in such a situation, you need a crisis resolution mechanism. You need something that helps to bridge the temporary period of illiquidity. We've also didn't look at this idea that if you have a single currency and you have integrating markets, you might want to make sure that what you've discussed in the previous session, that you look at regulation and supervision from a common perspective. And on the back of financial integration, the notion that if something happens in one country, it has an immediate impact on the balance sheets of financial institutions in other countries, and therefore you have a direct contagion effect. And people have come up with all sorts of trilemmas. I think there's about 16 different trilemmas out there of things that are missing. There are those who say, well, Schoenmaker, who said you cannot have financial stability in a financially integrated market and have completely fragmented supervision. You've got to do something in this. And there's Pisani-Ferry who came up with a new impossible trinity, basically say, well, if the central bank does not step in, if national fiscal policies do their own thing, then you will run into trouble because of the interdependence between banks and sovereigns. So if you want, what I would like to do is to extend a little bit the model of fiscal dominance versus monetary dominance to a notion which has yet to be properly defined, what we call financial dominance. The idea that the misbehavior of the banks forces the hand of the central bank. And that, again, if you would like to maintain a regime where the central bank is free and independent and capable to pursue its mandate that it has, is to preserve the purchasing power of our money in the Eurozone, then you also have to cater for that lacuna, which is that you might come into a situation of what we call financial dominance. Now, in the response to the crisis, is just to run you through some of these things. I mean, it's a bit of a more descriptive here. This is simply, we see the massive increase in debt. You see that some of them started from already a reasonably high level, and then, of course, massively increased through the financial crisis. We've seen the huge increase in spreads. And here again, that's why I said to you earlier, in the period before October, you see that essentially there was no differentiation whatsoever, a complete underpricing of risks. And then you have two things that you see here. On the one hand, you see a massive differentiation opening up between the national sovereign debt markets of the member states, and you see very clearly contagion. Basically, if there's a notion that something goes wrong in one country, then the markets look at other countries that have similar features, say a lower growth potential, a high debt burden, a particular geographic location in the south of Europe. I don't want to necessarily insinuate a particular degree of sophistication in some of this analysis, but this idea of a complete sell-off, if it looks similar, it must be similar, therefore it's better to sell it all at the same time. And this you see also in this chart about the increased risk perception, and of course the prices of bonds have gone down. Now, do the markets get it right? And as Delors said, coming back to Delors all the time, he said, well, the markets might not always get it right. They might be too slow or too abrupt. And here you see, I'll just plot a few things. You see the increase in the debt level, and you see the spreads. So in some cases, like Greece and Ireland, you see that things go up. So there's a notion the country is getting fiscally into problems, and therefore there must be a higher risk premium on this. And you can think that's a reasonable correlation. But you have other countries like the United States of America, or Japan for that matter, that have a huge debt burden, and yet can refinance themselves in the markets at very low rates. Now the question is that, you know, does that mean we have to fundamentally question our belief in market discipline? And one thing that has come up about this is a nice thing by Ada Turner. He said, basically, maybe the debt markets are fundamentally, there's a problem about the way they price risks. And that has to do with the payoff structure. If you're a bondholder, you don't care whether country X can pay back its bond for a long time. You really only care just before it's payback time. Okay? If there's bad news just before payback time, then your risk perception increases massively because you are afraid of losing the money you gave to that country. And that, whereas if you have equity, if you have a company, you see their earnings, you see their profits, and you have a constant assessment of whether this works out or it doesn't work out. And that maybe structurally leads to an underpricing of risk of debt in the period before the redemption. And then if there's bad news hits, you got a massive overpricing of risk. Now, if that's the case, then we have to ask ourselves about the role of sovereign debt markets in truly doing this disciplining job. Of course, there's the other side. They say, well, they are doing a disciplining job precisely as we see. Look at Italy. In Italy, the real reform really happened once yields hit above 6%, right? That's when there was a change of government, and there's a government coming in and say, yes, we have a problem, we must tackle it. But incidentally, in that period, Spain had much lower yields. So you ask yourself, is that assessment truly happening? You have maybe a similar episode is that, in fact, when Papandreou announced that the deficit would be 12% and not 6%, nothing actually happened for a week or two in sovereign debt markets. It was only when the first research pieces came out and said, well, at 12%, the Greek deficit doesn't actually look so sustainable, that markets started to respond. So, again, going back to Delors and just saying, well, maybe there are issues there about the way we've designed the EMU and that this reliance on the market to truly exercise the disciplining function, maybe we also have to rethink parts of that. Now, the new thing in this financial crisis is financial stability comes in and the role of banks. And that we've seen what we call the nexus between the banks and the sovereigns. And what I show you here is, maybe it's a bit difficult to see, but the point is you have on the horizontal axis, you have sovereign CDS. There's a risk premium on sovereign debt, meaning what is the likelihood that the government will not pay back on its bonds, will not honor its payment obligations. And on the vertical axis, you have the CDS for banks. So debt paper issued by banks, where you have the same perception. Meaning, what is the likelihood, as an insurance policy, what's the likelihood that the bank will be in such a difficult financial position that it cannot honor its obligations there? And what you see is in Europe, you see an almost perfect correlation. If the banks are in trouble, the sovereign is in trouble. If the sovereign is in trouble, the bank's in trouble. Why is this? It is called this feedback loop, and that is because banks, say in Portugal, hold a lot of Portuguese government debt. If the bank gets into trouble, because of property issues, bad loans, etc., then the markets start to question whether this bank is really a solid institution. And they say, who will help out this institution? It will be the Portuguese government. Now, if the Portuguese government is not at the fiscal limit, so to speak, doesn't have billions to spare to stick into its own banks, then people start questioning about the solvency of the Portuguese government. Now, if they start questioning the solvency of the Portuguese government, they start to sell government bonds, and they get marked down in their prices. Given that the banks hold a lot of their own sovereign debt, suddenly there's large gaps appearing in the balance sheets of the banks, which then makes investors think whether this bank is actually in a good financial condition. And so you are in a downward spiral in this feedback loop. The point is, you have this in Europe, but you don't have it in the United States. In the United States, if Wells Fargo in Nevada has a problem, there is not a question about the solvency of the state of Nevada, nor of that of the United States of America. And why is that? Because they have federal buffer mechanisms. The FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, they have the Treasury to come out, and they have kind of the Fed and supervisors to close down a bank if need be, and it happens. So there are things that are very different because we have that federal buffer system that we do not have in Europe, and therefore this is one thing where I have to see, well, this is a new dimension in the EMU setup that's then compounded, and I think it's my next chart, exactly, by financial integration, that basically banks hold the sovereign debt of other countries. And in this way, if there is a problem in one country, it has a contagion effect on the rest of the Eurozone through, amongst other things, the banking system. Now what we see is that the banks have actually recognized it. This is from our financial notification from the money market survey, the banks have recognized this and they stop actually doing business with people outside their own country. So we see a refragmentation of the financial market. And you have a couple of others from our own integration report, financial integration report, which shows very clearly that in the early years of EMU, there was this idea, yes, we're moving towards this, it's becoming a truly integrated financial market, one currency, one market, also in the financial markets. And now we see a retrenchment behind national borders, and basically domestic banks dealing with domestic banks and holding each other's assets, also placing them with us as collateral with the Euro system. Now, who can help out in this? Of course, and this brings us back to the ECB. It's a funny picture, I thought. Maybe not quite for children, but anyway. Is the idea that the ECB should come to the rescue, which is also the question that has been asked in the title of this session. And there, of course, there's this idea, what can the ECB do? Can the ECB break the feedback loop? And we hear a lot about the famous bazooka, that the ECB should just help out, for example, to buy up sovereign debt. And in this way kind of be the ultimate backstop to the system. Now, the question is, how would you like to frame that? Is that at all possible? And what will be the benefits of this? Now, there's those, for example, that say, why can't you be like the Swiss National Bank? The Swiss National Bank was fighting a losing battle to keep the Swiss franc down. And it has been intervening with 120 billion Swiss francs. And then it said, all right, I've had enough of this. I announce an exchange rate target. It's 120. And I back it up with everything I have. And incidentally, the pockets of the Swiss National Bank in producing Swiss francs are limitless. Now, the markets know this, and since then, the franc has been at 120, and I think on the first day, the Swiss National Bank had to intervene with 4 billion, and thereafter, it's been quiet. Because no rational investor would speculate against someone who's got the deepest pocket on the planet. And therefore, they say, why can't you do the same, say, for Italian government debt? The ECB can create euros at free will, deepest pockets you want, and you just buy Italian government debt. And you simply announce a yield target. You say Italian government yields shouldn't go above 6%, say. And it's credible, because you can actually do this. You have the deepest pockets on the planet for euro, and you will never actually need to do anything, because the markets will believe you. Now, if we think that through, what would it actually imply? It would mean, apart from the legal prohibition that we're not allowed to do it, but it would mean a few things. First thing, it would mean that we will be mentally and emotionally and operationally and so on prepared to put 1.9 trillion Italian government debt on the ECB's balance sheet. Are we in Europe prepared to do this? Because in a sense you have a supranational institution going in and doing something for a national system, and you have massive issues about accountability and so on and so forth. The second point is, even if we were to say, yes, we do this, we're willing to put 1.9 trillion euro of Italian government debt on our balance sheet, what would it mean for the central bank? If we have 1.9 trillion on our balance sheet, I think we should have a right to say how this money is spent and how the government in Rome should do its job. Because after all, you are financing them. And that gives you to a question where the central bank goes to Rome and says, your retirement age 68, please. Your pension's cut, and so on and so forth. Is that the role of the central bank? It certainly is not the role of the central bank. Is the central bank legitimated, mandated to do anything like this? Certainly not. And certainly not in our system. And that is the whole point I was trying to say, is if you go beyond the legal prohibition, which is very clear, we must not finance governments, even if you say to make the mental conceptual leap and say, okay, let's think about this, then you come to the next steps, and what you see is not what you like to see. And that is some of the things that need to be brought into this debate. Last point on this is also on incentives. Of course, there is an issue. If the central bank were to buy up any sort of government debt, there's absolutely no reason to run a tight ship on your fiscal policy, because there's a buyer of last resort for whatever you issue, a la Robert Mugabe. I'm exaggerating. But the point is, if there's someone who will finance you at any given moment, it's a free credit card. Why would you want to make an effort, rationally, to make sure your fiscal receipts match your fiscal expenditure? So these are some of the things where, some of the easy answers, the ECB to the rescue, should do the job, need to be thought through. Of course, we have intervened in the sovereign debt markets for reasons of the impairment of the monetary policy transmission mechanism through our securities markets program. We maybe can have discussions about this and if there's questions. I'm just showing you this chart that shows you, in comparison to other parts of the world, notably to the US, the size of that program is much, much more limited. Now, why are we, well, put it that way, the ECB, in the way it interacts in that crisis, puts a particular emphasis on banks. Why are we doing this? Because banks are so important to finance the real economy in Europe. And you see here, unlike in the US, where companies go directly to the capital markets, in Europe, your small, medium-sized enterprises that make the bulk of employment and the bulk of wealth creation in the Eurozone, they finance themselves through their banks. And if their banks are in trouble and do not want to lend, then perfectly competitive and solvent companies will find themselves in liquidity problems that drive them against the wall. And therefore, the central bank, we, through our non-standard monetary policy measures, have been focusing especially on the banks. Now, most recently, and let me just say a few things about this, is the long-term refinancing operation, where in 2 3-year operations, we supplied €1 trillion to our counterparties, financial institutions. Now, it has to be seen in the context of an exceptionally serious situation in late 2011. There was panic in the markets. There was a complete drying up of interbank markets, banks not lending money to each other. And that means that the intermediation process, which is essential for the functioning of the economy, that the money that savers deposit in the banks finds their way to people who have investment projects that are for productive use, that create jobs and growth. If that doesn't work because the banks are hoarding the cash, then there's a problem. And we were seeing this, and with it the danger of a credit crunch, that, as I said, that perfectly solvent companies would not be able to get their liquidity lines that they used to have. And with it, a perception of an inevitability of a catastrophe. I've just shown you on the right, if you see the media echo and the wordings, the discourse at the time, the euro was heading for the exit. It was clear this is not going to last. Even Sharon Bowles, the chairwoman of the Economic Monetary Affairs Committee, she said, well, there's a real question mark whether the euro will survive Christmas. Now, this was the discourse, and this is when these perceptions of an inevitable demise of the single currency had to be broken. And as a central bank, within our remit and with the focus on the banks, we undertook these 3-year operations. And indeed, we've seen some first impact on this. I show you here some charts just to quickly. So it's this notion that the spread, how much money, or how much more do you require to lend to other institutions, to other financial institutions? What's the risk perception? So that you would actually lend money to another bank. This has clearly gone down. We've also seen, and this is from our bank lending survey, when we ask banks and ask them, how difficult is it, or do you think that the lending standards, the difficulty of getting a credit is going to be harder or is it going to be less hard? And we see after the long-term refinancing operation, this notion that the credit standards will tighten further, that it will be more difficult to get credit, has decreased significantly. But of course, there are people who are critical of this, and not least in the country I come from, Germany, about a number of issues, and I just quickly want to address those. First, they say, well, all this money, there's €1 trillion out there, it doesn't reach any of the real economy companies. Now, we've also had a discussion about this last night. Well, what we know is, this is if you want circumstantial evidence. We know that in the last, for example, in the last refinancing operation, 800 banks participated, of which 500 were German. Now, we have about 12 large German banks. That means all the others are local banks, savings banks, companies that are close, banks that are close to the companies that make the bulk of in this case, the German Mittelstand. So we cannot say that, this money, euro for euro, is from us, it's gone to the banks, it's gone straight into the real economy. But what we can say is that those who have come to us in order to be part of these operations are actually the banks that do most of the business of lending to the real economy. There's those who say, well, you've got $1 trillion that you've given out for 3 years. That is an excessive risk for the central bank and its balance sheet. Now, we have a strict and differentiated risk management framework, meaning there are haircuts. So banks come to us and say, I need 100 million, and they have to give us collateral. And looking at the quality of the collateral, etc., we say, yes, you can get 100 million, but you got to give us collateral worth 160 million. So in case there's a depreciation in the price of that collateral, we still get our money back. We will only make a loss if there's a double default. So if Deutsche Bank comes to us and gives us collateral, a share of Mercedes-Benz, then before we make a loss, both Mercedes-Benz and Deutsche Bank have to go bust. And so the likelihood of this is, again, what human calculation can produce is probably not a thing that is of so particular concern. And the next thing is, of course, there's a dynamic balance sheet of the central bank, which I show you here, which may be a bit complex. It simply shows, you see on the top side, this is the kind of liquidity we bring into the system over the time. And on the right, you see the blue. You see two things. This is a 3-year long-term operation. First, that it substitutes for other operations. So the banks who have come to us for a 3-year operation don't come to us now for 3 months operation or 1 or 2 week operations, okay? Because they've sorted themselves out with a 3-year operation. So you see a decline of those. What you also see is we've done previously a long-term operation, the 1-year operation in 2009, summer 2009 till summer 2010. And it worked precisely in that way. The banks came to us and they got liquidity of 442 billion against collateral. And a year later, they returned the 442 billion and they got back their collateral. So this idea that this is a trillion out there which the bank will never see back again, I think it's simply in the moment when the intermediation doesn't work, when banks feel they need to be awash with liquidity in order to feel safe to go out and lend to the real economy. This we've done before, and so we think is a part of a breeding process of the balance sheet. Last point is, with all this money sloshing around, isn't that future inflation foretold? And there, well, we have to look, of course, here, what are the different concepts of liquidity? What we give to the banks, it will have an inflationary impact if it shows up in a large increase in the monetary aggregates. Because we've seen from history that, when especially the broad monetary aggregates, M3, when it goes up, within 2 years' time, inflation will go up. But we don't see much of what we call the money multiplier at work at the moment. And most importantly, and you see this in the chart on the left, is that inflation expectations are securely anchored. What you see on the left is what we can distill from financial markets instruments. These are instruments that incorporate a notion of future inflation. So this is not people saying future inflation will be at 2% because the central bank tells them. These are people who have put their money behind it. This is a bet that future inflation will be 2%. There's real money behind this. So these are instruments that say, look, I buy this with this kind of yield structure and so on and so forth, on the assumption that inflation 5 or 10 years from now will be 2%. So for as long as these inflation expectations are securely anchored, and that is a very important part, the moment these go in a direction that we don't like them, then also the central bank will intervene, both on the liquidity side, but also with our main policy instrument, which is the interest rate. I'm speaking far too long. Now, just quickly to say something on the gaps in economic governance. This is something that colleagues of mine have done, simply saying, well, actually just to show a lot has happened already in filling those gaps. This is, if you say monetary policy is 100% in a federal competence, how much Europe is there in fiscal policy, in structural policies, in macroprudential, and in the aggregate. And I have run you a little film. Before the crisis, this is where we were. And as we start launching the governance reform that we have, the supervisory reform package, the Euro Plus pack, the ESM, reinforcement of the ESM, and the six-pack, you see that overall, through incremental change, we have filled a lot of gaps, or we have made massive progress in governance. You can say it's not enough. The point about this is simply to say the markets, the media, they only focus on the delta, what's been agreed at the last summit. But if you go back and say, look, what has actually been done, and say in 2009, if I show you one thing, the stability mechanism. If someone would have told you in December 2009 that in spring 2012 we will have 500 billion on the table capable of doing precautionary lending, loans for financial assistance, bank recap, primary purchases, secondary market purchases, people would have said, wow, you guys are ahead of the curve. You know what you need to do to address this crisis. Now we have it, but because it's come in incremental steps, if you want the revolutionary impact that it actually has, that we've created this thing, and it is a very solid institution, world's best capitalized international finance institution, largest regional IFI. This goes a little bit unnoticed, that the fact that a lot has actually happened. But there's one thing where, and we've just talked about the supervisory framework, where we feel that it's not enough is being done, and that is that basically we need to break that financial markets problem of the nexus between banks and sovereigns. And most recently, my biggest boss, Jörg Asmussen, came up and said we must build a financial market union, we also must build a fiscal union and a political union. And just my last slide, what would a financial market union or banking union, which is now all the rage, you see in the FT today, Draghi has been in the European Parliament yesterday. What is the kind of thing we're looking at? It essentially means, what we've been discussing earlier, that there must be something at the federal level that can go directly into the banks at the national level. And if there's this fiscal component, if, say, the ESM needs to recapitalize, say, a Spanish bank, then there must be a joint supervision, because this is the ultimate thing that a supervisor can say, well, you must close down, or you must merge, or you must be recapped, or so on and so forth. There's a lot of politics in this, but I think people have understood that this is the next step that is urgently needed, and that, if you want, and this brings me to the end, because otherwise we have no more time for questions, is to say, if we are working hard to overcome any notion of fiscal dominance through the six-pack, through the fiscal compact, etc., we now have to make the next step to actually safeguard properly this notion of financial dominance, that the banks get themselves into such a trouble that the monetary policy maker, not the fiscal policy maker, might feel that it forces their hands. And that is why a banking union is, in a sense, the next step that will fill the lacuna in the governance framework. Thank you very much indeed.
That was one of the most interesting presentations I heard for a long time. A couple of questions, and I'm from the Commission, you know, I was from the first panel. A couple of questions on the ECB interventions for the banking sector. You said that if you took 1.9 trillion of Italian government paper onto your balance sheet, then you would have to go and do some governance work and impose discipline. It would be a logical consequence with the issuer of the paper. Now, what you've just done is taken 1 trillion of bank paper onto your balance sheet. So what are you imposing in terms of discipline and behavioral remedies on the banks in return for taking all that bank paper onto your balance sheet? Second question, you said you require collateral, you require a haircut, and you only risk making a loss in case of double default. And you quoted the case of a German bank that would give you a Mercedes paper as collateral. But of course, if you lend money to a Spanish bank, for example, hypothetically, and you accept Spanish government paper as collateral, then the risk of double default is much, much, much higher. Because of the interaction and the feedback loops. So is there not quite a significant risk at some point in time of losses there which would have to be monetized? Those are my two questions.
All right. I go one by one. It's always nice that the colleagues from the other European institutions are always the most challenging ones. Collegial support. First, on taking on the bank pay. Well, basically, of course, they come to us with their collateral. Now, we've had this discussion also last night. The story is there clearly. We have to ask ourselves, what's the role of the central bank? And is it actually the role of the central bank to impose conditionality? When I said, if we take 1.9 trillion on our balance sheets of Italian government, it means a quasi-fiscal role, okay? And fiscal policy is something that needs to be legitimated, needs to be run by the politicians. If we try to put banks into a position where, on their funding side, they feel so reassured that they can actually go out and do that thing which is risky, which is to lend to companies, because you don't know whether the investment project will work out or not. What we can do is to put the banks in that position. There's a German finance minister who once said, we can lead the horses to the water, but we cannot make them drink. And that is what a central bank with this liquidity operation can do, is it can put the banks in a position where they can go out and lend again, and they don't feel constrained on that side. Now, do we like that the banks just take the cash and walk off and do whatever they want? Of course, we say what banks need to do, but again, this is maybe more for the EBA and for national supervisors to say, well, you need to do what we call balance sheet repair. And what does that mean? That means not paying out dividends. That means looking at your compensation packages for your top management. That means making sure that you use this opportunity to put your house in order. We are saying this. Now, the question is, can we impose it? Should we impose it? And if someone can impose it, should it be the central bank? Now, these are all questions. We say very clearly, the treaty says we have a social market economy organized according to the principle of free competition. And that means that these are not state-directed banks. These are private enterprises that will make decisions on the basis of, what their shareholders tell them and what the regulators impose on them, but the regulator is not the European Central Bank. You can say it would have been better if we had done the LTRO with some sort of joint thing with the EBA, or maybe like it would have happened in the US, that there was one regulator said, all right, this is how it goes. Well, as I said, we were in an absolutely extraordinary situation at the time, and I think the EBA had its own issues with the recap and so on and so forth. So ideally, maybe that would be the way, but it didn't work out that way. First question. Second question on a double default. Well, of course, if you say a Spanish bank that gives a Spanish government paper, and because it's a nexus, and because the default is anyway much more likely, therefore you're going to have a loss in your balance sheet. Well, I think this is your zero hypothesis that Spain will make it. If your zero hypothesis is that Spain will make it, then some of the probabilities that you insinuate don't necessarily show up in your calculation. Now, but be that as it may, we still have a very differentiated risk control framework. And we, as I said, it's not that, they come for 100 million and they give us collateral for 110. It may be 160, it may be 170, it may be 180. So the margin that is there is quite significant. And also what you insinuate is that if there is a default, theoretically speaking, there is a zero recovery rate, which historically is not the case. So in that sense, I'm not saying here everything is everything super. With increased lending operations comes increased risk. There's also no problem in clearly saying this. But we are a central bank that undertakes this action. It has been, if you want, an emergency situation, and this is a risk where we say, yes, we do that.
Thank you very much. My name is Andrew Robinson. I've got 3 questions. The first is relating to the communication of the positive content of your final slides. An earlier slide of yours showed the cover of The Economist in December. To what degree do you think the communication of the positive changes that have occurred since the trillion or so euro injection has been understood by journalists, commentators, so that the emotional climate, if you like, is following the positive trends that you've indicated? Because they unfortunately sometimes create the weather. The second point is, I'm advising on a meeting later this year between the French and British governments, the title of which is, for this seminar, The Financial Crisis and the Real Economy. And you've mentioned Jacques Delors, and of course François Hollande is a disciple of Jacques Delors. I wonder whether the Delors view over many years is that there should be a different sort of political governance of the ECB, which just doesn't aim at price stability, but also the creation, in inverted commas, of jobs. And my third point is, do you think that most members of the EU understand today, after the crisis, or during this crisis, that EMU isn't simply, they understand that it's economic and monetary union, not economic or monetary union?
All right, let me try to take it one by one.
The last point was raised by Draghi, by the way, in a press conference a few weeks ago.
Yeah. Well, maybe I start with this one. I think we're in the process of realizing that economic and monetary union is in fact political union. And what we're doing now is to put into place an institutional framework that makes it clear that what we've written down, that economic policy is a matter of common concern, is not just a word, but it actually means something. It means that people can look over your shoulders, that Brussels can intervene, that Brussels can look over the execution of your budget, that Brussels should recommend a pension reform and insist on a pension reform if it's needed, can say you must reform your labor market, etc., etc. I think we're now realizing that in order for this economic monetary union to work, for countries to prosper in them, to not build up huge imbalances, this is what we need. And that's the next step. This is the fiscal economic union. Is essentially recognizing that monetary union is also a political union. First point. On your last question. On the first question, you're absolutely right, and it's actually one of the themes I feel most passionate about. The Eurozone has a massive issue about discourse. And the reason for this is that those who analyze and write about the Eurozone are looking at it from the outside. It is happening in London and New York mainly. This is where the financial markets are, and this is where the commentary sits. Some of these people write because they don't feel they are affected, which I think is a big fallacy. Point one. And point two is there's, of course, you have, in London especially, on the US also, but incidentally also in Germany, you have a big I told you so faction. People who have been quiet for 10 years of success of the euro, and now feel that they've been vindicated by what they've seen. And these get a lot of airtime. Now, I don't want to blame it on just the nasty Anglo-Saxon media and so on. There's also an issue about the way the European institutions, but also national governments communicate. I think the Spanish government right now is a key example. But also there's a notion of the markets want to see an announcement and they want to see follow-up. If you go and say, we're going to do this is going to be our deficit, and 3 months down the line you say, well, actually, it's not going to be like this, it's going to be much worse. And then 3 months further you say, well, it's actually even worse than what I told you 3 months ago. That reinforces a notion in the city, in New York, that that particular authority just doesn't have a handle on their own economy. And that gives you a sell signal, very straightforward. And I think there's a clear issue about saying, this is what we commit to, and under, if you want, all circumstances, we will honor that commitment. And if growth falls short, we find equivalent measures, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a notion. And then there's a clear, a straightforward communication story. As I was telling you yesterday, for some reason now, the evening news in Germany has always a Spanish success story. A company they pick out in Spain that is a success. And it reinforces in the population this notion that Spain is not a basket case. They're actually good at some things, and they're world market leaders. And I think that there's something where also kind of active communication can do something. Last point on François Hollande and the role and the mandate of the central bank. First, France is still in election mode. Until the Assemblée Nationale has been elected, let's just take this as an overall umbrella period of the presidential elections in this. And then I think we should reassess the whole situation. Now, next point is, should the mandate be changed? What's the role of the central bank? Of course, from our perspective, what I showed you also about monetary dominance, etc., we feel that it's been a trial and error process in creating monetary frameworks that has led us eventually to the combination that we have. An independent central bank focused on price stability. And we have delivered. Delivered better than the Bundesbank did in the years before. So if you say, and you ask the people of Europe, what is your concern beyond the crisis? They say, well, I don't want the real value of my money to be eroded. I want price stability. And you say, what's the best way of achieving this? Then, I'm not saying it's the best and the best and the best, but from what we know so far, backed up by theory and empirics, I think we have a pretty solid framework. And incidentally, other central banks around the world, not to say they follow the ECB, but I mean, the Bank of Japan has redefined its monetary policy framework and has come up with an inflation target of around 2%. The Fed has started to do press conferences, incidentally, like we did starting in '99. So there are trends where you say, well, actually, there seems to be some sort of consensus that we are not totally off the mark, to say with all modesty, with the monetary policy framework that we have.
Sure. I'm one of those very evil young financial analysts in New York who will eventually be working, and it would just seem, despite what you say, is there any way the ECB could ever reinforce a form of credibility independent of other countries? I mean, everything you say is really dependent on the countries themselves, but the ECB itself has no real talking voice. I mean, no one really believes what's going on in Europe, and thus the ECB in turn, there should be some form of voice separation, so to speak, between the two. And there's any way to reinforce the ECB's kind of own recognition in the process for these financial markets? Is there any way of doing that? Thank you.
I hope I understood correctly. Are you saying the markets are listening to the bank because it's the only real voice, and that there's the politicians out there you cannot actually know what to talk about?
You can't really differentiate between the two.
You can't really differentiate between the two. Well, I'm not sure I think there's a clear difference also in the way, if you see how markets have reacted to our announcement and our operation, and how they sometimes react to other announcements. I think the way is simply that the system is a bit more complex in Europe than it is in a nation state. In the US, you have the Fed, you have the Treasury, and they can sit together and thresh out a compromise if they want to talk to each other, all in their independence, etc. And that's being perceived as quick, as smooth, as effective. In Europe, we have more people around the table, if you want, as a structural feature. But of course, we can also improve there on the communication. The point is, and I think Mario Draghi has made it very clear, if you say in the markets there's a mix-up between what the ECB does and what the governments do, I think it's been very clear that the ECB has done its part, and the ball is now in the court of the governments, and the governments need to do their parts. And that is what I told you. It's about deeper governance, it's about a fiscal union, it's about a banking, financial market union. They have to go down that route. The central bank has done its job, and it's over to the governments, because we have our mandate, and that's what we do. All right.
Gabriel, thank you very much. Now run.
Yeah, I will.